Years ago, I used to make a bunch of these belt pouches, we'll call them. They were originally designed as a sporran pouch. And I made them for somebody else that was selling them at a Renaissance fair because I had to work weekends. I never was able to actually sell out there very much. But somebody I know had a booth and he sold them. So they work really well for costumes and things like that. I've also sold them at craft fairs as just small purses, if I add a strap on to them especially. They're a pretty versatile little bag, and I mostly wanted to make a video out of them because I recently just found the pattern laying around and remembered that it's a great example of putting a cloth liner inside of a bag like this, and how did I do that. And I've tried to explain it to people, and I get that vacant stare as their mind shuts down and restarts. So I think it needs to be shown rather than just explained. But what I'm going to use for making this bag is these two pieces are going to be cut out of a softer leather. They're going to be the bag body itself. You'll notice that they don't really line up with each other. That'll get explained a little bit more later. And then these two pieces, one of them's for the belt loop on the back, and one of them is just a decorative piece that goes on the front and adds some weight to the flap. Depending on what you're doing, that is what holds the flap down, is just that added weight. But you can also add other things on there, bag clasps and so on. I'll talk about that at the end of the video, the variations that I've made of this. But for the softer leather, I'm going to use this milled veg tan that I got, that I cut a lot of lace out of. This is actually a scrap from cutting 1/2-inch lace. Most people don't have scraps this big, so I wouldn't say that this is necessarily a scrap project. It is for me. And then I'm going to have a scrap of, looks like about 8-ounce leather that was for 8 to 9 or something, for a holster that went wrong somehow. I scratched it or did something wrong and decided to just scrap it. And I'll cut the other pieces out of that. And then I need just one little strip of 1/2-inch wide stuff that's going to be for attaching some rings to the back of it, because originally, like I said, it was kind of designed to be a sporran. So it had 2 rings that it could be tied, they just clip onto like chains on a belt. But those could also be used for a small strap as well to attach those. So it has different options that people can use it for. This is the same leather that this is. It's just a little bit darker because it's been oiled up. These tight corners, it's best to punch a hole. Cut out from that hole so you don't wind up with little nicks there that are going to cause problems later. I'm also going to just use a bag punch to punch these longer slots in it. Again, not an absolutely necessary tool. If you don't have a bag punch, you can just punch 2 holes and cut the leather out from between them. But it's a lot quicker to have the right tool to do the job. Alright, those are our 2 main body pieces of the bag. Got a little bit of corner here to cut out. That's done. Then we'll need our 2 pieces out of the thicker veg tan, the stiffer stuff, and I'll need some cloth pieces that are the exact same size as these pieces. Excellent. Need the bigger amount. Alright, now of course these pieces need to be edge beveled and stitching groovers, because it's all going to get stitched on. And I want to finish it and finish the edges before I do that. I think what I'm going to do next is some skiving. Now this piece that's going to be attaching the rings on the back. You can use a D-ring or you can use round rings. I'm going to use round rings in this case. But anyway, it's just going to go through there. It's going to be long enough that it can fit through the slot in the back of the bag and have a couple rivets punching it in there. You can stitch it as well. Rivets are quick and easy. But I don't want a lump in the back of the bag from it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it off. I'm going to skive the ends of the pieces, and when I put them together, they're going to not quite line up with each other. So one of them's going to end, it's going to skive down to nothing and end, and the other one skive down to nothing and ends just a little further. So it all tapers down nice and smooth. So we need a piece 3.5, 4 inches long, something like that, to be able to get a couple rivets in it. If I tear the ends up a little bit, it doesn't matter as much on this. It will on the next bit of skiving that I have to do, which is probably optional. But the goal here is to have it transition right down to nothing. Now, these pieces. This is going to be the front of the bag, and it will later on get folded down to finish that edge. And that'll be after we've got it all lined. And actually, it's one of the last steps on this to do that. But again, we don't want this big lump on the back of it. So I skived this edge as well, so we don't have a lump that might eventually show through on the front of the leather as it gets worn some. So it's going to get the same treatment. It's going to get skived all the way along that edge. Not these necessarily. And this one's got a similar thing that goes on. The front of it needs to fold down and around. And especially in these corners, if it's too thick, it gets very cumbersome. So all of this edge needs to be skived down so that it lays nice and flat and smooth. and works well. And on this leather, I might have to wet it a little bit to get it to do what I want, but we'll see. If you're planning on not skiving this and just like finishing this edge, you would have to cut off about a 1/2 inch around here. You could leave it just kind of like this too. It probably wouldn't hurt. It's just it's going to have a funny effect up here, especially since the other piece gets folded in as they get stitched together. It'll stick out kind of funny. Okay, while I was out that, I went back and skived further in, all the way around to thin that whole area that's going to be folding. And now I think I can get it to fold pretty well without too much extra bulk showing up. There's going to be some little... This is perhaps not the easiest way to skive something. It's what I've always found to be the best and easiest way for me. But most people can't quite master this. So just use whatever method works for you. There isn't necessarily rights and wrong methods in leatherworking. Some people like some tools, other people like other ones. And it just all depends on what works for you. Now on this one I did scallop that edge a bit right there. I went too deep and went through basically with the skiving. It's not going to be that big of an issue. I'm going to trim it a little bit because it's going to be folded around on the inside. And about 1 inch of this folds down. So it's going to be well inside the bag. It is going to be something that somebody using it might notice. But as I said, I'm going to trim it a little bit. I've got some extra here to play with. That's all the gratuitous skiving close-ups, but we could do a little bit of stamping on this piece. That's going to be the next step. Let's wet this down and do some stamping. When pieces are wet down like this for stamping and they're still a little too wet to stamp, it's a good time to kind of go through with the edge slicker. And you're not really finishing them yet. You won't do that until it's all dyed and finished and everything's done. You gotta be a little careful not getting too much of this done on here. But it's a good time to go through and just kind of shape that edge and round it out. Now let's mark in a border a little bit from the side of our stitching line. That's just using a wing divider. And let's go with, let's grab that ring divider again and put a line kind of down the center to follow with this tool. Mostly down the center. That one's a little better. Now this should be, it doesn't look like much by itself, but it should be a stacked square tool. And it's used by lining up on that line, this point down here, and the very notch of this V up here in it, should both line up on that line. Couple good hard hits. And we'll do a partial impression above it by leaning it out from the other tool. And we'll kind of lock into that tool and work our way down the line. Ooh. Hopefully not do too many of those double impressions. Another partial impression down there. Got that one kind of deep. Sort of like the effect though. Maybe I want to do all of them deep like that. Deep on the top. If you can't tell, I haven't had much chance to play with this tool yet. I'm still learning a few tricks on it. But I like the way that works. Doing the impressions real deep on top really makes that other one stand out like it's another layer. And from then on, you should be able to feel the impressions that are previous to it and line the tool up with them. And I am going to continue a straight impression and then tilt it a little bit and do it deeper on the top. And I get down to the bottom here. Again, a partial impression. Just to define the bottom of this cube. As per usual, anytime I do a sort of geometric pattern, basket weave, whatever, I'm going to go around with a border stamp on this line and camouflage it all in. I say camouflage because it could be just a camouflage tool used for this. And the way I line this tool up, I'll turn it around so the camera can kind of see, is the inside of this crescent here. I put right on that line, and then I match the point to the point of the previous impression. Of course, doing it where the camera can see what I'm doing means I'm not seeing what I'm doing. Kind of a neat pattern. Now we've got to let that dry. Let this dry. I finished the edges on it as well. Well, didn't finish the edges. I slicked them a little bit. And once those are dry, we can dye them and finish them. And then start assembling the bag. I still have to cut out the cloth pieces. But again, like I said, they're just the same as those two other pattern pieces. I'll do that off. A few things that are worth mentioning about the lining cloth. I use a pretty heavy cloth for lining. I don't like the really lightweight liners. Normally it's like a 6 to 8 ounce canvas, or 6 or 8 ounce canvas, I should say. This is actually an undyed cloth of some sort that's a twill weave. It's almost like a denim. But it'd be like considered a bottom weight type fabric. It's a pretty heavy fabric. Not what you would normally have as a lining in something. But I think your liner should be heavy enough to last a few years, and really as heavy as most people make their cloth bags in some cases. But the liner is always the part that I'm going to have go bad. I've replaced liners in bags that I've made after they've been used for years and years and years. So, the other things to mention about this, on the patterns, I'm not going to punch or cut any of these holes, so I don't need to mark where those holes are punched. If I need them, they'll be there later, but like these slots, you don't need those because that doesn't come through inside the bag itself. It comes through between the outer bag and the liner helps you not ever see those pieces. So that's part of what the liner's hiding. So I don't need to mark that. I'm not going to cut that. I probably will mark a second line inside up here. I'll use this pattern to make an outer line, and I'll probably cut along that second line about a 1/2 inch in. So basically as far in as these notches go, and I'll just trim this. Will actually be a little bit smaller than the leather piece, because that leather piece, remember, is going to be folding over that edge, and I don't have to fold the cloth piece and then fold the leather piece over it to get it all to work. Another thing about cloth is to have the right tools to mark it. These are, you can get these at any fabric store, just about anywhere. These are chalk sticks, and you can get different colored ones to go in here. Like if I'm working on a black piece of fabric, I'll use white or yellow that you can use. You just don't want to use something that doesn't work with the fabric that you're working on. Like, again, like using white on a white fabric, it's hard to see. And if you do everything right, you shouldn't have any of this chalk left later, but it could technically wash out if necessary. Just wipe it down with something wet. That makes an easy to see pattern. And speaking of washing the fabric, you might notice this fabric looks a little kind of wrinkly and so on. That's because this has been washed. It was washed for several reasons. One is because I scavenged this fabric and it was kind of dirty to start with, so I had to clean it up. But the second is a lot of times cotton fabrics, especially canvases, can have a very odd smell to them when you get them, and you need to wash that out unless you're planning on dyeing it right away. Then you dye it and then you wash it. And I think it has to do with them preparing it for the dyeing process is why it smells the way it does. Otherwise, cutting out the cloth is the obvious answer, a pair of shears. Now the 1/2 inch in, to make this a little bit smaller that I'm going to do, I'm just going to kind of freehand mark it. They do make little gauges that you can buy at fabric stores for marking something like this, for marking in a line, for doing seams and so on, seam allowances. I just usually don't take the time to do that. I'm confident enough in marking about 1/2 inch in. Especially since it's only in about 1/2 inch in. It doesn't really matter if I get a little bit more, a little bit less. I'll just fold in less of the leather. Or I'll trim off more later, whatever. But yeah, that'll be my actual cut line. Then just a little bit further. So these pieces are dry now, and I decided I like the way they look. I'm going to just leave them mostly a natural color. And I'm going to use this new neat-like finish that I've got. I've had people ask about the applicators I use for dyes and finishes, and it's a sheep wool scrap. It's basically, this is chrome shearling that had a thicker hair on it, thicker nap on it, and I just took a pair of scissors and cut it down. Basically gave it a haircut. And I will use these and rinse them out and reuse them a whole bunch of times until they start to get really matted down, and then I grab another piece of it. But it's just scraps of shearling. Either from a project, or at one point I was lucky enough to find a big bag of it for somebody who was selling as scrap. And the reason I like it for finishes is that it holds quite a bit of it in there and spreads it on fairly evenly. And you can cover a large area fast with it. And get a nice even finish by sort of lathering it up with it a little bit. Okay. Now we gotta let those pieces dry again. And I'm just gonna rinse this out with cold water. If you rinse it out with hot water, the hair will turn into like a felt as it gets smashed down. May or may not be a bad thing, depending on what you want to use it for and what finishes and dyes you're going to use. But if you rinse it out with cold water right away, then you can just keep reusing it dozens of times. Okay, now that we're almost there, I'm going to finish up the edges on these pieces real quick, and then we'll be ready to start the assembly process. I'll talk about what I'm going to do on that. Now, I've been trying out this Tokonol burnishing gum. I'm not sure I like it as well as the gum tragicant that I've always used, but I figured I'll use it enough to give it a good solid try before I make an actual opinion, form an actual opinion on it. So projects like this are a good opportunity to give it a shot and see what it does. Okay, now assembly. First off, this is like the last piece. First pieces we need to work on is the parts that are going to be stitched on before I do any of the lining. And so I'm going to add on this piece. I think it makes it look like a pig nose. But that's the belt loop. And it goes up pretty close to where these rings are. And I'll just stitch that on, and then I'll come back up here and I'll put these loops in and rivet those in place, and then we can start with lining and everything else after that. So first step is getting this on there, and something that makes that a lot easier is some of this double-sided basting tape. You can stick something in place and it stays put while you go to sew it. Now I don't want to put it in the center because a belt has to go through there. But I can put it on each side where the stitching is going to be. No messy glues or anything to deal with. Just stick it on there, and if you get it to separate from its backing paper, which sometimes can be a bit of a trick. There we go. It leaves a double-sided tape on there. And we can just stick that where we want it. And like I said, we want to kind of be almost where the top of this is in line with the rings there. Alright, now I'm just going to go down and sew this, and I'll be back. We'll take the whole thing down to the sewing machine later, and I'll take the camera down with me for that. But this is just stitch around that edge. It's easy. Okay, I've got that sewn on now. So next step is to take these loops through the rings, and we'll go ahead and put those in place, and then, as the frog says, rivet. Now if you push down on this, you can kind of still see where our loop is in there, and I'm just going to use that as a guide to punch the holes through, and just punch through all 3 layers at the same time. And in this case, thicknesses of everything I'm doing, small rivets are going to work. Enough of it sticks up out of the leather that it's going to catch. But sometimes you have to go with, if you're using a thicker piece of leather here and a thicker piece of leather here, you might need to go with a medium rivet on each of these, or a medium rivet and a small rivet, which can be problematic because then the heads don't usually match. But you can always put a medium head on a small rivet. It just doesn't necessarily, you wind up with an odd number of them eventually. And one of my little quirks that I've always done is I like to set the rivets with the round dome side of the setter, and then I turn it over and I flatten them off. It's just something I like the way they look when they're flattened off better. And as I was saying before, these could be used to attach it to a belt. It can hang from these. It can go with the belt through this loop. You can also just put a strap on these about 3 feet long or so and make it a shoulder bag. So this makes it a pretty versatile bag, just putting these 2 different things on here. And they're not expensive to add on. Another thing that you could have added on here instead of this is you could have just used a piece like this with a spring clip in it. And just, you know, stitch that on there, rivet the spring clip on. And then you've got a spring instead of a belt loop for people that don't wear belts and they just want something that they can clip onto a bag, a pouch of another bag or pouch, or they can clip onto just a waistband or something like that. That's one of the variations on this theme that I've done. We're getting into lining it, and this is the part that starts to confuse folks. So when we're going to stitch the bag together, it's going to stitch together what's called right sides together in fabric. But the liners need to be stitched kind of the outside, the inside, but you don't want the seam sticking out on the inside, so you need to do it one or 2 different ways. Either you can sew the liner together as a bag, sew this together as a bag, and then fold the edges in around the liner and finish it all up. Or, the way I prefer, is I'm going to attach this piece first by folding this edge around. I'm going to glue it in place and then it's going to get stitched. And then I'm going to sew all the rest of it together at once. And I'll have to show you how that happens. That's the part that normally when I explain it, people get confused. And the glue I'm using in this old mustard bottle is white glue. It was sold as leather weld or leathercraft cement. I think it's just sold as leathercraft cement now. Phoebing's had a version of it that was just called leathercraft cement. And I like it for this stuff because it stays flexible when it dries, and it dries clear. So if I get a little bit in on the lining, it's not too bad. It is noticeable, but it's not too bad. There's special tools for spreading glue around like this, but I've always just used my fingers. I'm sure there's more professional ways. And we're just gonna fold it in and start clipping. The other thing about this glue is if you have a finished surface on your leather, it will tend to wipe off of it. So it's not real good at gluing things that have a finished surface to another thing with a finished surface. But it is good for things like this where you're trying to glue the unfinished surface. And you don't want to get any on the outside, on the finished side. And we get up here to where we're starting to curve. And we need to work some wrinkles out as we go. Now once we stitch that, we'll stitch pretty close to this edge, and we'll have a finished edge then that's rolled for our flap. And then this piece will go on, like I said, just to the decoration, a little bit of weight. It could also be to cover something else up if we decided to do a different type of clasp on this. This one I'm not going to mess with that. It's just going to have the flap style. But you could, and you'd be doing this right now actually, or right after you stitch this and before you put this on, you could put in a magnetic clasp on this. And that is just one side of it, more than likely just the little stud side here would need to be set through this leather right now, or again right after stitching it, but before you did this. And the other side would need to be set on this piece before you put the liner in for it. So you'd need to figure out where it was gonna fit with that, and this folded down, and then give it some room, and then you can figure out where it was going to fit and set that side. Now we're down at the sewing machine, and I often do this on a machine I have that works really well for cloth, and to stitch this outer line, but this is a little bit thicker leather than I think I can handle on that machine, so I'm going to do it on my big machine, which has the added advantage of having reverse, which the industrial machine I sew cloth with does not. So it actually makes this a little easier to set up and do. And we're going to try and stick pretty close to that edge. And we'll see how this machine handles this. Now, of course, one of the other variations on the theme on this bag is that you could just leave it like this as your flap and not put that decorative piece on there. It's just there, like I said, for decoration and weight. This would do the job. But we're gonna... Okay, this good solid table for laying things out is actually that other sewing machine that I was talking about. Old-fashioned industrial machine. And we'll use this surface to get everything laid out where we want it. Now you have to remember that this piece is going to be folded down. I've got those holes marked where there's going to be later, but we're folding down almost an inch of it. So you have to kind of remember that as you're putting all this together. So we're back to basting tape. And I'm going to work around that edge. And like I said, this stuff doesn't really do curves great, but it can kind of do curves. Alright, and once we have that laid out on there, and we can start to stick this stuff together. Now this is not going to stick 100% to this finished surface. It's a little bit waxy. It takes a little bit of finesse to get it started. And it really only holds it on just well enough to make everything stay together while you're working. So my usual method on laying this out is I just try to center up the bottom of this pouch on the bottom of this front piece. Like I said, right sides together. So your pouch pieces, the finished outside surface that's going to be the outside of the bag, are getting stuck to each other right now. And I'm basically just matching my edges up. And it helps to kind of make it into a 3D shape as you do it. It's probably not easy to see from the angle of the camera just yet. I'll turn it around so you can see that now this pouch is actually pouched out. So we're going to stitch that and then turn it right side out, but we want it to wind up right side out with the liner inside of it, and we don't have our other liner piece on there yet. So our other liner piece is going to attach on this side. And we're going to have what we consider our right sides of that, which is actually going to be the inside of the pouch. This cloth really doesn't have a right side and wrong side, but we're going to put those together. So now we've got, the liner is going to be inside in, the way it's supposed to be. The pouch is going to be inside out. And they're then basically the same way. Work our way around. Clip those together. And you should wind up with about as much cloth sticking up over the edge as you do leather. If you don't wind up with it perfect, it doesn't much matter, because a bunch of this cloth is going to get folded over and tucked under as the leather gets folded over. So now, this double inside out bag sort of contraption, this is how I line them, and this is the part that always confuses people when I explain it to them. That it's really a simple process, but it's a little hard to figure out exactly how it's going to work. I'll get this stitched and I'll show you how it just turns. Just turn this part right side out and it's pretty much lined. All you have to do is fold this edge down over this and set it. Now I've got a 1/2 inch basting tape in here, so I want to stitch in about a 1/2 inch in from the edge. So all that basting tape is either in something that I can trim off or just leave in the seam. I don't have any of it on the outside, though you can rub it off and kind of pull it out of there. If you get some sticking out on the surface, it can be cleaned up. As usual on stitching, whether you're stitching by hand or stitching on a machine, if you start with several back stitches, 4 or 5, and then stitch over them and around, that'll lock everything in. You don't need to tie any knots or anything crazy like that. They actually don't help. Knots will come loose, back stitching will not. Now all we need to do is trim this a little bit and fold this right side out, put it all together. But first I'm going to go ahead and put on my piece on the flap up here while I'm still down here where I can do some stitching real easy. Now I just stuck this piece on with a couple pieces of that basting tape and kind of an equal sign on the back of it. Nothing really special. And since this is something that I'll be stitching all the way around, I don't even have to worry about back stitching it. I will just start up here near the top, and I'll stitch all the way around and then back over the stitches again for a few stitches, and that'll lock it all into place. We're getting close to done on this one. I've just got a little bit of trimming to do. I'm cutting it along here and just trim off some of this that's outside of this so that it'll make it a little easier to turn everything. I don't think I mentioned, or I might have mentioned, but I don't know how much I mentioned these shears before. I found these at a farm supply store. They're made by a tool company, Crescent Tool Company. And I had to sand a little bit on the handles to get some rough edges out of them. But otherwise, they've got really comfortable handles that actually fit my hand, which is kind of unusual in shears or scissors. And I am cutting through 2 layers of pretty heavy cloth and about 2 layers of, that's almost 5-ounce leather. And it cuts right through it. They're made to cut shingles and things like that on job sites. So for that, I don't know how the hell they do, but they're pretty impressive for cutting leather. And they're even not too bad on cutting cloth. I'll have to look and see if I can find a link for these and put an Amazon affiliate link in the description. Because highly recommended shears. Alright, now, normally on upholstery type leather, this is really easy to do. I'm not so sure on this heavier veg tan, milled veg tan, how easy this is going to be to do. But I need to turn the bag right side out. Basically, this piece needs to flip around and wind up on this side. And to do that, could be a bit of a fight, like I said, with this veg tan. I have in the past used like my mallet handles, like I'll put the head of the mallet down on the bench and then use the top of the handle to push the bag down on smaller bags and things that are harder to get your hands into. But this one I think I'll be able to do just fine. It's working. It's just harder to do than normal. Just doing it by hand. Once you get it mostly there, the rest isn't too bad. I'm just taking and pushing on that seam that I've got sewn in there and pushing it out. Okay, now finishing steps. Last thing I need to do is get all this folded in and lined up so that we can secure that, and then it'll all be together. So to do that, usual methods. kind of fold in some corners on the liner and fold it down. There could be glue, there could be basting tape involved in this. Might make life a little easier. I just get it kind of all neatened up a little bit in there where I want it. And usually I take and trim a bit of the leather out, so we don't have a fold there that's going to be problematic. And then I will just fold the leather down in. Make sure everything's where it needs to be. And again, glue, basting tape, stitching, whatever you think you want to do, whatever you think is going to work. But it can be held just by rolling it down, punching these holes, and setting some grommets in it. On this stiffer veg tan that I'm working with, I'm not entirely sure it's necessary, but I'm going to go down and put a line of stitches across there just to hold it in place while I'm working. But it should hold just fine with some grommets as long as you catch both these pieces of leather and have that cloth pinched between it. Alright, now let's set some grommets and put the drawstring in on this. So first things first, punch in some holes. I'm just going to use a leather block inside of it. You can use a cutting board, or you can try and twist it all the way around where you can get to the where you want it to be without too much trouble. Obviously you don't want to punch through and through the back of your bag. That is classified as bad stuff. And I don't know if the camera picks it up real well or not, but I do have some spots marked where they were from my pattern, and I just used them as guides. I try and make sure I'm going to hit the leather underneath. I just sort of use those as spacing more than anything else. And setting grommets. And grommets, at least with this grommet setter, are very easy. They pop up through the hole. I like to usually put the longer part of the grommet on the outside here. Makes it a little harder to get to the setter, but it's not too bad. You kind of push the bag out of the way. And let's see if these grommets are gonna set right. Because this leather is, again, just a little thick. But this setter is pretty good because it goes through the center of the grommet, keeps it all lined up, and rolls it out once it hits the top there. So you can really kind of get in there and compress the grommet into place. That just rolls out around that inside there. Like I said, doesn't deform in any way. A lot of grommet setters that don't have that pin that goes through the center will wind up, the grommet will squish into the center and you wind up with an oblong hole. These keep a nice round hole and roll everything out real nice. They're quite a bit more expensive though. There's probably somebody out there that's wondering what this little scrap of leather is that I'm messing with here and why it's important for a drawstring. And actually this is our slide lock on it. You can get modern little plastic spring things that go onto drawstrings that you pull it down tight, lock it in place. But it doesn't really fit the aesthetic very much of this bag. So I went ahead, I just take these little, it's a scrap of leather, I don't know, 6 ounce or so. You can finish it up if you want. I don't usually bother. I don't even have this one really straight. But it's just there's something to lock the lace in with. And you need to make a big enough hole that you can push the lace through doubled up, whatever piece of lace you're going to use. But you want it to fit pretty well, pretty tight. And then when you want to move it, you just pull on it, it pinches and those holes line up. But then when the lace gets pulled on, it pulls it straight and it doesn't want to slide then. So you can just pull it into place and it locks itself. Pull it down out of place and lock it in place. Real simple. Running lace through either hole on either side. Should wind up inside the bag. And since this lace's a fairly tight fit, you can usually get away with a single overhand knot. It's almost more on a signature than anything else, but I like to use figure 8 knots. Want it to be. I'll go ahead and take this off for now. So obviously you could just tie a knot on one end of the lace, beat it through, call it good. But for demonstration purposes, I started in the middle. And I usually take a little bit of the extra time in there to straighten lace out as I go. And then again, just tie off a stopper knot of some sort on the end there. Like I said, I'm using a figure 8. Trim some excess off. Now let's put our piece back on here. And I'm going to do it the other way around from what I had before. So like I said, a tight fit is really important for this. Make it last longer. And then we need to shape our bag a little bit as we compress these strings. Again, if I used the chrome tan upholstery leather that I normally use for this, I wouldn't be doing as much of this by hand shaping here because it would just pull tight. But once I get it shaped, it'll work for whoever I make it for. So this veg stand leather is going to need a little bit of breaking in. But aside for a couple things I need to trim up, I think this one is done. Now, while this little belt bag is together, it's got the belt loop on the back, it's got the 2 rings if somebody wants to wear it with the chains like a sporran. There are variations that I mentioned. Like I mentioned, you could put magnetic clasps on it. You can also put these fancier little clasps on it. Now you may want to do this instead of this decorative piece, or you may want to move this decorative piece up, or even add a little bit more down here onto the pattern, but that's going to change and make it harder to do the rolled edge if you do this. Now, the rolled edge, of course, is an option. yeah, I think it looks nice. It looks very finished. Looks very professional. But you could just leave a rough edge there, or if you're using veg tan like this, you could even burnish that edge. With the Tokonole, supposedly you can burnish some chrome tan leather, so an oiled chrome tan might even be able to burnish a little bit to finish that edge up some. So different options on how you can do that. You could have just trimmed that to shape and left it. You can put this decorative piece on here, or not. You can put a bag clasp on there, again, or not. Different versions of bag clasps, not just these little swing clasps, and whatever you want. I've also seen where there was a concho used like a button, and then down here was a piece sewn on that the lace went through and made a loop, and you could just snug it down tight over that button, and that holds it shut. It's a lot of different variations. Something that I've done a lot with these at craft shows is I would have straps along, and usually they were smaller versions of spring clips, not this big huge one, but a little one, on the end of a 1/2 inch strap. And then I would just have one end with a clip, the other end I would tie on, and I could adjust it. I'd make the straps long enough that I could adjust it there at the show for whoever's buying it. So it just basically wrap around and up through and tie on with a lark's head knot. And then the other end would have a clip. But you could, of course, just tie both ends on. Again, depends on your aesthetic, what you're trying to do. I'll do this one, kind of explain a little bit more what I'm doing. Go through the ring, wrap around the back of the piece of lace. It goes back down and through the ring again, and then it goes up and follows right with this piece of lace up underneath that loop. And then you have a tied on strap. Of course, you could leave it long to be adjustable. You could trim it off once you've got it set for the person you're wanting to make it for. And like I said, I would take them to shows and just have extra strapping, because sometimes these bags would be on the shelf and somebody goes, oh, that'd be really great if it had a strap so I could use it as a purse. I'm like, well, sure. And I'd tie a couple pieces of lace on it and they'd be very happy. So, as I said, versatile little bag. A lot of different variations you can make with it. I may be making a digitized version of the pattern for this and putting it on Etsy just to see if it sells, if anybody's interested on that. If you are interested, let me know in the comments. It might actually help me, spur me on to get the job done, because I don't like doing homework.